global business here at the Fletcher School, and I also direct the Institute for Business in the Global Context, which is the host of this series. And at the Institute, our mission is to have an open discussion, teaching, research, and other forms of learning and interaction on all things at the intersection of business and the world. And there is a common saying that if you do this thing over here, it's just business. And everything else you check at the door. And that everything else is all the stuff that we know surrounds us, that profoundly influences everything we do. But in the context of business, you're supposed to check all those things at the door. Just business. Now, we use the term just in a different way. Just as in justice. Just as in business, sitting on a framework, a set of principles that guide the objectives of business. And when you think about the stuff that you check at the door, it could be politics, it could be security, it could be the environment, it could be religion. We know these issues permeate everything else we do in life. Why shouldn't they permeate business? And that is the basis of all talk of business, all teaching of business, all research of business at the Fletcher School. And that's what distinguishes the conversations, the narratives that we have over here relative to practically any other place in the world. So I'm delighted to start off this edition of Fletcher Futures on the topic of a somewhat unusual intersection, business and religion. And our last topic was, if those of you who managed to catch that, if you haven't, we are recording these events. We have a recording of the previous one. Our last topic was business and cybersecurity. The one before that, we looked at ease of doing digital business around the world. So this is going to be an ongoing discussion about an intersection that is fraught with possibility, that is fraught with risk, that's fraught with opportunities for leadership. Business and religion. I can't think of two people who can help us, better people to help us get a perspective on this question. Two of my favorite colleagues at Fletcher, Professor Elizabeth Prodromou, who is an expert on the issues of religion, faith, business, conflict resolution, human rights. And Clare Gooding, who just recently graduated, 2018. I still remember the day Claire first sat in my class. And now she is a leading light at Catholic Relief Services, just returned from Southeast Asia. And I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth and Claire to say a little bit more about their perspectives, not just on the larger question of religion and business, but also a little bit about the work they're doing. And I will leave the floor to them to have a conversation, and we'll all listen in. And then we'll have an opportunity to unmute ourselves and ask them some questions. Over to you, Elizabeth and Claire.
Thank you, Bhaskar. Thank you, Agnes, and thanks to all of you for being here today. Claire, would you like to start?
Sure, happy to.
Okay.
Well, as Bhaskar mentions, I was an MIB student just a few years ago. I'm very grateful to Fletcher for that education. I came to the MIB program with a background in international affairs and refugee services. I had served at the Holy See, which is the diplomatic arm of the Vatican at the UN in New York. I'd also worked for the US refugee program in East Africa and had operations roles in a few other international organizations. And I had chosen the MIB program because of the business acumen I was looking for to continue in operations, but also because of that interdisciplinary element and environment of Fletcher, analyzing our work with a diplomatic, historical, economic lens. And this was the kind of environment that I knew I wasn't going to get in a traditional MBA program. And one of these other lenses that I've always been particularly drawn to was that of religion. In my work, particularly in emerging economies, There is no pretending that religion and spirituality don't permeate the lives of the people I was working with, the workforce that I was working with. It defines people's choices. Sometimes it causes prejudice, sometimes it causes discrimination, but it animates the lives of the people that I was working with. It animates my own life as a person of faith. And this really captured my imagination, joining a business program, but also joining a school where there was recognition that faith and religion is an important element of how we work with people. So when I first came to Fletcher, I attended one of Dr. Prodromou's talks and was quite intrigued by this academic analysis of this that we're going to be talking about today. She grounds business within the historical and social analysis of faith and of religion. And this was really important to me as a student because I had seen it on the ground in my work, and I knew that it was going to continue to affect my work in the future. And it was through this that I got involved with Fletcher's Religion, Law, and Diplomacy group. And that year we were exploring the intersection of business and this term called religious literacy. Religious literacy can be defined as the knowledge of and the ability to understand religion. It's the importance of being religiously literate as an element of being in a globalized society. So seeing the links between faith and culture in particular. We'll probably talk about this a bit more, but we put on a conference that happens every year. And that year we had a visiting professor from Georgetown School of Business. And he said something that resonated with me, and I think may resonate with some of you as well. He talked about how the research that is going on now suggests that with the globalized world, secularization isn't happening as had been predicted in secularization theory. Religion was not losing its place or its influence on people. In fact, it was quite the opposite. He quoted that 10 of the fastest growing economies, and this was back in 2017, every one of those 10 was a religious majority country. So it really suggested, especially to myself as a business student and to some of my colleagues, that retaining talent, being able to effectively sell products, being able to work respectfully internationally as business people, you have to have an understanding of that religious influence. So that was very impactful on my Fletcher time and how Dr. Prodromou and I got to know each other. So the brief background there, I'll maybe turn it over to Dr. Prodromou. I'm sure we'll come back to this conference as well, but very pleased to be with you all today.
Great, Claire, it's great to follow you and to welcome you back, even virtually. And Claire's about to add to the Fletcher family for the second time, so I had to share that. She's about to have her second child. So
hopefully not during this hour.
Not during this thing, that's right, that's right, yeah. So, although that might be quintessentially Fletcher, but anyway, the adventure of Fletcher. It's great to welcome you all here, and I'm glad that you're with us and considering coming to Fletcher. Claire talked a little bit about the issue of religious literacy, and I'll come back to that, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I got to Fletcher, or how I came back to Fletcher and to study and do research and teach on religion. I'm a political scientist by training, and I was a Fletcher master's student. I was a Tufts undergrad. And when I was at Fletcher, there weren't really many ways to study religion and international relations. In fact, at the time you had to choose 3 fields, and my fields were international finance, international business, and communist area studies. So that gives you a sense of when I was at Fletcher, a field which no longer exists. But in those 3 fields, there really was rarely a mention of the issue of religion. And I have always been very interested in religion and international affairs and religion and historical change. So I finished the Fletcher School, and I had an adventurous pathway myself that took me back to Fletcher in 2014. I worked in international banking for 5 years, and I largely, worked on rescheduling sovereign debt from Latin America and East Asia. I noticed in the international banking environment that there was rarely any attention given to the significance of culture in questions of economic development, economic equity, economic justice, and certainly not in issues related to the ethics and best practices of finance and banking. When I left banking, it was to go back to MIT to do a degree in political science. And there I wrote a dissertation on religion and democratization in Greece. And there at MIT, I was, very, very fortunate to have two chairs on my dissertation committee, the late Myron Weiner, who worked on India, and Suzanne Berger, who works on France and Western Europe. And both of them were very interested in looking in particular at how religion affected processes of economic development, industrialization, and soon post-industrialization, and also processes of religion and regime change and building democracies or sustaining non-democratic, whether totalitarian and authoritarian regimes. And so it was at MIT that I was introduced in the strange, bizarre, exciting environment of MIT to the systematic study of religion. And for most of you, I'm sure that if you take a step back, you'll see that religion is really part of being religiously literate, as Claire mentioned, is really an essential skill, set of skills and tools and knowledge for understanding really all of the existential issues of our current moment, whether we're talking about COVID-19 or other zoonotic pandemics, whether we're talking about climate change and disruption, whether we're talking about weapons proliferation. Faith-based communities have worldviews, have knowledge resources, and have on-the-ground skills capacities to contribute either constructively or destructively to solutions to these existential issues for humanity and the planet. And whether you're interested in religion and diplomacy, religion and politics, religion and geopolitics, I teach a course on geopolitics, religion, and security in Eurasia, for example. Whether it's geopolitics or whether it's religion and business, I would urge you to think about in your Fletcher studies and in general, the importance of being religiously literate, thinking about where and how, both visibly and invisibly, obviously and indirectly, and perhaps less obviously, religion in some way, ideas, actors, organizations, institutions play a role in the global challenges and opportunities of our time. I wanted to say a little bit about the initiative on religion, law, and diplomacy. Claire was a leader in the student club on religion, law, and diplomacy, which is part of this big umbrella of the initiative. We have an annual conference. This year it'll be on geopolitics, pluralism, and geopolitics, pluralism, and religion in Ukraine, and looking at Ukraine in terms of broader Eurasian trends. We have a guest speaker series throughout the year. We've had, for example, Brian Grimm, who is the founder. He was a former senior Pew Foundation expert who does a lot of quantitative analysis, but he founded the Religion and Business Association Foundation. We've had speakers like him, and we have speakers who cut across sectoral areas of focus and expertise and disciplinary areas of expertise. And then we do research that involves religion, for example, religion, migration, and security in the Mediterranean, religion and diplomacy. So this is the RLD initiative. But I want to zoom in now to religion and business specifically, just for 2 minutes, and then we can open to conversation. Probably all of you, or many of you, have probably heard of Max Weber's seminal work on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. And I mention that because that is a seminal reference point. Published in the early part of the 20th century. 2 of his essays, early 20th century, actually published in English in, I think, 1930. But that, that book, or that treatise really opened the way for thinking about the connections between religion on the one hand and economic development and all that goes with that on the other, whether we're talking about business in the private sector, whether we're talking about multilateral institutions that deal with economic development and economic equity questions. And Max Weber's reference point takes us fast forwarding to the present. Think about the significance of Islamic finance, Sharia-based and Sharia-compliant finance throughout the world. Think about the partnership, the strategic partnership between the World Bank and the OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation's Islamic Development Bank, to try to ramp up joint work on investment across 56 Islamic Development Bank countries worldwide. Think about the private sector, for example, and debates in the United States, but also in other parts of the world about the impact of religion on private sector behaviors and the legality or not of those behaviors. In the U.S., the very controversial cases of the Hobby Lobby. There's the perhaps less controversial example of Chick-fil-A, which is closed on Sundays because of it being for the Chick-fil-A owners a day of rest. Think about what's happened all over South America, a formerly Roman Catholic majority continent, but which now is a far more religiously pluralized, denominationally pluralized continent, where Pentecostal Protestantism has grown exponentially. And one of the reasons that Pentecostal Protestantism has grown so quickly is because of the ways in which ideas about faith and prosperity, faith and discipline, faith and initiative have led to a proliferation of small businesses and economic development and closing of equity gaps. So I mention all of these because we see that religion religious ideas and institutions and behaviors animate business writ large in the private sector space, but also in multilateral and international institutions that focus on questions of economic development, the development of robust middle classes, and the associated development of democratic regimes. A couple of final points just to sort of illustrate this. If you think about China's Belt Road strategy, China's Belt Road strategy is very deliberately being now augmented by a focus on cultural and religious heritage preservation and sustainability, with the economic strategy, the geo-economic strategy linked now to a religio-cultural strategy. I can say a little bit more about that if you're interested. Think about the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. Religion figures in those Sustainable Development Goals specifically, but also in relation to issues associated with gender equality and economic development, religion and human rights as that affects economic development. So I would just urge you to think about the ways that religion may be very evident in the work that you're interested in on business, but that may not be immediately obvious, and see religion and religious ideas and institutions as capacity builders and enhancers for the kinds of issues that the private sector may be interested in, or as potential impediments as well, but to be then religiously literate and aware, as you would be economically, politically, or diplomatically aware. I think we're open to questions, right? Discussion, questions. Bhaskar, you're still muted.
Yeah, so one thing that perhaps I would encourage you, Elizabeth, to do before we launch into questions and discussion is to have a conversation with Clare about her journey since she attended your class and the conference that you've been organizing, beyond Fletcher, and how some of her experiences, perhaps echoed some issues that might have come up during the time that she was at Fletcher. And Claire, any reflections from your end about your journey beyond Fletcher, how that might have connected you back to a conversation that you might have had with Elizabeth in the years past? So we're here to eavesdrop, really, in terms of reuniting the two of you and letting you have a conversation.
Well, actually, I do have a question right off the bat, if you don't mind, Dr. Prodromou. To me, it's quite fascinating what's happening in China at the moment. I work in Laos for Catholic Relief Services. I'm a program manager there. And just this summer, we received Homeland Security's, the US State Department released something called the Xinjiang Supply Chain and Business Advisory. And they were cautioning us as, you know, a business or a workplace operating in Southeast Asia that we needed to be very careful about our supply chain coming out of Xinjiang province because of the documented persecution of the Uyghurs and the ethnic Muslims living in that province. And it does look like the US government is taking a very serious approach to this. An approach to the re-education of mass amounts of people, the forced labor facilities, and now they're warning US businesses, you need to be quite careful of your supply chains. And this obviously has been in the news as well because, you know, Disney just put in something like 200 million into Mulan, this, you know, this blockbuster movie, and now there's a whole protest movement against it. And I was reading one analysis that said Disney should have been much more religiously literate about where it was filming and what was happening in the environment. So I'd be quite curious to know your analysis of that, because this is a perfect example where our businesses, I think, and you know, you had said it yourself in the past, sometimes businesses don't want to necessarily get into religious freedom questions because it's uncharted territory of how they engage that. But this is a great example where Disney stands to lose a lot of money because they weren't forward thinking on this in how they were filming. And many of our other supply chains are going to be affected by this as well. So one question that's been on my mind, I'd love your thoughts on it.
Oh, okay, that was a lot. So I can see that. Well, and I knew this anyway, but that nothing has changed since you were at Fletcher. These questions, which have layers and layers, but just to say a little bit about China, I actually visited Xinjiang in, now it's 10 years ago when I served on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And we spent almost 2 weeks in China on a fact-finding mission on religious freedom violations in China. And the travel to Xinjiang was probably one of the most memorable and powerful experiences that I had as a diplomat, but also as a person, to see the kind of oppression and repression that Uyghur Muslims were subjected to then by the Chinese state, which is an officially secular state, and therefore is hostile in general to religion, but has moved to a kind of religious management approach to the emergence of the re-emergence and then the of old religions and the emergence of new religions. And in the case of the Uyghur population, the Chinese state has always viewed religion as a source of threat to the state's control over the local population, a source of social cohesion that was outside of the control of the state, and that, you know, ultimately was linked to, from the Chinese perspective, security threats associated with transnational connections to global Islam and Islamism. That's also the way, in fact, that the Chinese state has viewed the Tibetan Buddhist population as well, that they see Buddhism as a faith tradition that is outside of the control of the Chinese state, therefore antithetical to social order, social control, and ultimately to territorial integrity. So the Chinese government has framed both Tibetan Buddhism and Xinjiang Islamism as a threat to China's territorial integrity. They call them splitists in the discourse. And to zoom in then to the current sort of discussions, the Chinese government is doing a couple of things when it comes to the maltreatment of the Uyghur Muslim population. One, of course, is to to develop this narrative of that population as religious radicals, but also to begin the wholesale destruction of mosques throughout Xinjiang province. Seeing, the destruction of worship spaces as a means to eliminate assembly. So we have that connection between freedom of religion and freedom of worship on the one hand, and freedom of assembly on another, and therefore on freedom of speech, the ability to exchange freely speech and ideas. So we see the wholesale destruction of mosques to prevent that kind of assembly, and also as part of a strategy of eradication. Not only is there control of the people, but eradication of any physical evidence that of the historical memory of this community. And that's not unique to China. We're seeing that in Turkey, and with examples of the Hagia Sophia and the destruction. Now that's reverted to a mosque, but erasing the Christian components of the Hagia Sophia. So this is a kind of global phenomenon of non-democratic states. With regard to supply chains, this is where religion and religious freedom issues become very important, because the private sector is complicit in many cases, the perpetuation of modern forms of slavery through supply chains that include everything from indentured servitude and indentured servitude wages to the trafficking and smuggling of human beings globally, both regionally and globally. And China is, in Xinjiang province in China, is at the intersection of human trafficking and smuggling routes. So we see through the private sector the contribution to different forms of contemporary slavery, and religiously vulnerable populations are, oftentimes disproportionately victimized by this phenomenon of slavery through supply chains. And then finally, you mentioned at the end, businesses don't want to deal with religious freedom issues. This was a common lament and, sort of complaint of the human rights and religious freedom community in Washington when I served in DC, that the rush, the globalization of our economy and the rush of U.S. businesses to set up shop in China meant that participation in an environment that disrespected human rights and certainly disrespected religious freedom, and not understanding the Chinese state's approach to managing religious freedom or controlling religious freedom, meant that private sector and global corporations were complicit again in the violations, everything from the right to own individual property to collective property, the ability to assemble freely, the ability to speak freely. And so the private sector becomes part of a state project that violates religious freedom and all the other human rights that go along with it. And that, I think, is either it's an act of omission or commission, and the film is, one hopes, omission and not intentional, but ultimately it produces the kind of consequences that you are describing. Claire, can you tell us a little bit about your kind of footsteps through Fletcher, and in particular to Catholic Relief Services? Because I think, although I know in other contexts, when you've talked about your origin story, you've talked about your dream being to work for CRS, but how we brought CRS to Fletcher, and then you and Fletcher to CRS through RLD.
Absolutely. So I had known since I was quite young that I wanted to work for Catholic Relief Services. It is the humanitarian arm of the U.S. Catholic Church. And it is quite a large arm. We have 7,000 staff globally. Our operating budget is about $1 billion globally every year. And in the last couple years working for them now, I have worked in Sierra Leone and Ghana and now in Laos. And I mentioned this a bit at the beginning, but I knew coming into this work, especially the operations side of my work, that I needed business acumen. Hence, I moved to the MIB program. But you cannot prepare yourself for international work unless you understand these other dynamics of diplomacy and religion that you're going to be facing, because you're managing a globalized workforce. We're managing service delivery. So yes, we are an INGO and, you know, a nonprofit, but we do service delivery just like any other business around the world. And so it's been quite important for me to understand when I go into a new country, what are the religious expectations of my workforce? In Sierra Leone, there was an expectation that every meeting I started had a Muslim and a Christian prayer. There was expectations around the burial practices of my employees. When they had a family member who passed away, what was the proper response of myself as their manager towards that, because of the religious expectations of the culture. And even today, my staff in Laos, it's the end of Buddhist Lent, and there are a lot of expectations around them as employees, having the day off, having this holiday, being able to celebrate with their families. So Fletcher was very instrumental then in helping me develop this side of religious literacy ingrained in the operations side of what I was doing as a business student. When I got to Fletcher, I think there weren't too many people in my class that liked this intersection of business and religion. I think I was able to convince a few of them that it was worthwhile. And we put on this conference through the Religion, Law, and Diplomacy Conference. And Bhaskar, I don't know if you remember this, but I remember coming to your office to ask you for money to sponsor that conference. And I think you kind of looked at me like, you want me to sponsor what? But it ended up being a fantastic, rich conversation with Brian Grimm, who Professor Prodromou mentioned. We have an international expert at Fletcher, Dr. Warde, who is an international expert in Islamic finance. He was one of the first people who, I think he's been teaching there for over a decade, and he looks at Islamic finance mechanisms. How do you create Sharia compliant investment products? He also is quite adept in talking about why religious literacy isn't just important for the creation of products, but also the vetting of products, because you also need to be able to vet the fraudulent financial side when sometimes people try to take advantage of affinity groups and religious groups by creating products for them. So that also was a very rich conversation that we had, that religious literacy cuts both ways. It both is something you need in order to create positive products and positive workspaces, but also to be very analytical, to know when someone's trying to take you for a ride or when someone's trying to be fraudulent in what they're doing. So those conversations at Fletcher have been very important for me now, because I utilize them in my work day to day.
Claire, to pivot off of what you mentioned, we had at the conference that you mentioned, someone from the Tannenbaum Foundation for Interreligious Understanding, and they're based in New York, but they do global work, and they do work on interreligious peace building. But they also do a lot of work on religious diversity in the workplace, and they do training programs that are geared towards developing religious literacy and a religiously diverse workplace. And particular for those of you who work on migration, I mean, we know that one of the consequences of the migration process is the creation of ever greater degrees of social and religious pluralism, and that's reflected in the workplace. And so the kind of training programs that Tannenbaum runs, I think, are very much part of the present and future. And indeed, when you were at Fletcher, Claire, we talked about how Ernst & Young had just launched their own religious literacy for organizations program. And it's basically a diversity and inclusion training program for a culturally and religiously diverse workplace. And I think, in a climate where, certainly in the US, where we're rethinking and recommitting to principles and ethics of diversity and inclusion, and hopefully that's global as well, but certainly it's a central part of the conversation in almost every workspace in the US or every, professional space in the US. One of the things that's been very interesting to me is to watch whether or not religion is included in the conversations about the diversity of identities, and to see the degree, the residue of what you talked about at the beginning of your introduction, Claire, the secularization thesis, that religion is something that we don't talk about in our professional spaces, or we don't analyze, but we analyze other forms of identity, race, ethnicity, gender. Religion is simply language. Religion is simply one more of those. And one of the things that I think is very interesting in terms of, epistemic questions is why it is that, religion remains a sort of a point of ambivalence when we have these conversations about identity, even though we see these major corporations committing to religious literacy in order to be profitable, but also to create a more inclusive and principled and ethical workspace. So that is something that grew out of what we were doing when you were at Fletcher, and it's continued.
Absolutely. I went back and was reading that, and that was 2017, 3 years ago, and I was surprised by how much of what we thought was brand new. I mean, here was one of the big 4 accounting firms that has religious literacy training. I mean, it was kind of unheard of at the moment. And now there seems to be a much bigger recognition. I know Apple, all the big tech firms, they have, I'm going to forget the acronym, but it's employee resource groups or employee affinity groups. And oftentimes they have one that is faith-based as well. And the stories that are coming out of those talk about how important it is for employees to have that these groups, and when companies can display religious literacy, it's not just good for their performance and their morale, but it's good for business branding, and it's good for the understanding of that diversity within their workplace. Now, I think we're starting to face, and I don't know if this is necessarily in your wheelhouse of expertise, but I've been noticing, this concept of woke capitalism now is moving, it's taking these understandings of the diversity of your workplace, but sometimes then creeping into some of the messaging of corporate cultures. And that's actually something that I've been wrestling with too now, is where is the line between allowing employees to bring their whole selves to work, but also recognizing that you're gonna have people in your workplace now that are deeply, deeply different. And there's that diversity of thought has to be managed in a very appropriate way. And companies have been doing this all over the world in places where there is religious tension. So it's not like it's unheard of, but I think here in the US, we're now about to face some really deep questions about what is the appropriate messaging of corporations and corporate culture that balances the diversity of the people you have in it, that allows them to bring their whole self to work, including their religious identity, but also recognizes that agreement or uniformity is not going to be there. So that's, I don't have an answer to that, but that's definitely been something that I've been wrestling with as I look at kind of the changing trends.
So Claire, it's interesting you use the term woke capitalism. There's another dimension to woke capitalism, which of course could be a topic for another hour if we had the luxury of it, which is woke capital markets. So if you think about the role of the Catholic Church and Catholic organizations in ESG investing, environmental, social, and governance based investing, or the role of Islamic finance in providing capital markets. And you mentioned Professor Ibrahim Wardeh and his work in that area. There is a role of family-based businesses, which are a lot of which are guided by religious principles, whether it is Jewish family-based businesses or Hindu family-based businesses or Islamic family-based businesses, where capital, goes through a set of religious frameworks. So the whole concept of woke capital, from the perspective of capital provision itself, relies so heavily in so much of the world on religious issues and religious principles. It's fascinating. So if you think about the challenge for a portfolio manager, an investment manager, and they are managing an ESG fund, they have to understand what to screen for. And then you have to kind of go back and try to understand what are the principles that your client, the Catholic Church, may be looking for, right? And of course, guns are off the table. The so-called sin-related industries off the table, but there could be more. And these concepts, I'm assuming, are going to continue to evolve over time. I know that there are some questions on the table, so perhaps we could pivot to those, unless Claire or Elizabeth, you have a few points to make.
No, I'd love to hear the questions, and I would then remind everyone of Max Weber, because woke capitalism doesn't make sense unless you read Max Weber. So that connection between capitalism and religion as an ethical system that extends to economic practice and business and finance practice.
Absolutely. Agnes, do you want to just read out a question that might have come over?
Sure. And this was actually a follow-up on the China discussion. One of our participants says, I've turned into business studies from the cinematic and art field. During my research, I initially attempted to conceive a cross-cultural cinematic mechanism, but the more I dug into the subject, I found that it was not only a mission impossible, but also highly sensitive, both on the US and the China side, where I attended school. Just like Professor Prodromou mentioned, organizational culture building has been many corporations' methods on this, and I'd like to hear more about how you think about this, especially that the U.S. is more culturally heterogeneous domestically than China. He also mentions that just one more comment on this. From my perspective in China, actually the Tibetan Buddhism has been quite influential in the cinematic literature and cultural field, just to say, because even though I have some ethnic friends there, I hadn't lived there, but assembly issues actually has been a long one in China. Turning it over to you.
Wow, that was incredible. I wish I could remember, actually, one of our second-year students, I'll look back in my notes, who's hoping that his capstone will be to write an opera on Israeli-Palestinian relations. So bringing the arts directly into the Fletcher School and to conflict resolution. On China, I guess what I would say, just as a general point, and I'd be happy to, follow up in more detail in a conversation later, but is that, we tend to think of China as either secular, and secular meaning in that regard largely anti-religious, or as religiously homogeneous. And I think one of the things that's very interesting about China is its religious heterogeneity. And that's something that our upcoming conference on Ukraine will focus on. Ukraine is one of the most religiously diverse, religiously plural countries in Eurasia, but China's religious diversity is growing, and it's remarkable. I mean, Christianity in China is the fastest growing religion in China, and by 2050, given current global trends, China will be the largest Christian majority country in the world. And that's, multiple denominations, but certainly Protestant Christianity and to a lesser extent Roman Catholic Christianity. There's the huge Muslim population of China, the Buddhist population of China. There is, a small Hindu population in China, and then there's the indigenous, faith tradition of Falun Gong as well. And China's religious diversity, I think, is something that oftentimes is overlooked, and that's why I think your work in the arts could be especially important. It's a way to sort of reveal and express and teach about that religious diversity and that cultural diversity that goes along with it, but then the implications for that on economic development, but also on hopefully a liberalizing shift towards more inclusive politics and, maybe someday democracy.
So Elizabeth, your current student who's writing a capstone on opera is following on a breadcrumb trail. We've had Fletcher students work on such issues in the very recent past. Our recent graduate, Patrick Kabanda, who was also a graduate of the Juilliard School, wrote about the role of music in fostering relationships across countries and across cultures. And he's written a book called The Creative Wealth of Nations. Right after Fletcher, he went to work at the World Bank. So,
Okay.
yeah. So
well, he's not my capstone. This student who's going to do the advisee, who's going to do the opera. He came to talk to me about Israeli-Palestinian issues and different approaches to conflict resolution. And then he said, okay, I have something to tell you. It's maybe kind of radical. I haven't shared it yet with my capstone advisee. I want to write an opera on opera as conflict resolution and Israeli-Palestinian relations. But there you have it. The arts are alive at Fletcher, both from the student you described and this one. Yeah.
It's interesting because most of the operas that one remembers are the ones that are full of conflict. So
yeah.
It's a great way.
So I guess it's a paradigm shift for opera too. Yeah.
Other questions, comments?
We don't have any questions in the chat, but please feel free to chime in, put up your blue hand.
Put up your blue hand. I think that'll be the best way for us to be able to find you and hear from you.
You know, while we're waiting, Professor Prodromou, one of the things that Dr. Grimm has talked a lot about is that in his estimate, religious groups contribute, he says, $1.2 trillion to the US economy every year. You know, he has his way of calculating the amount, both through the businesses that religious communities run, the social charities, the healthcare systems, etc. I mean, that's quite interesting to think that if China is on track to have this type of religious diversity, despite how we think of it as a secular organization, it'd be very interesting to see research on what their religious communities are pumping back into their economy, because it's not something we ever consider. America, we know, is a religious, country, and so that's why I think calculating that number isn't as shocking. But that would be quite interesting research to see what are the religious communities in China producing in terms of money back into that economy.
Right, right. And some of that may exist. Brian Grimm was formerly at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, so his quantitative analysis has always been comparatively focused. But the trend that you described is also something that we've seen, again, anecdotally, but more in qualitative research on the impact of Pentecostalism in South America, and the kind of recycling of wealth back into the economy that comes from faith-based businesses and the faith-based community. And I think we're definitely seeing that in terms of all of the tools at the disposal of Islamic finance that are focused very much on sectoral consumption, etc. So I think this is something that is a trend for the future. And also, just to avoid thinking that this conversation is all about religion contributing positively. We all know that religion also contributes to violence and disruption as well. So that's another reason, if you're interested in economic stability and economic trends or foreign direct investment. I do a lot of work on Turkey, and watching FDD just decline precipitously in Turkey because of political instability and the insertion of religion very actively into society and Turkey's geopolitics. It's just an example, but there are so many others. So it's not all upside. There's also downside, but that's another reason to sort of take religion seriously and in the work you might do on business, finance, and economics.
Yeah, on that point, just speaking of the negatives, a lot of my work has to do with trying to understand the role of technology around the world and getting a better handle on the extent to which technology is a multiplier versus being a divider. And you think about how social media has become the mechanism by which religious differences get magnified. And kind of the most egregious examples in recent years has been the harassment of the Rohingyas in Myanmar.
Right.
And that's just one example of many where the platform has been used to galvanize, religious persecution and separation. And if, as a Facebook executive, you do not fundamentally understand these religious fault lines, then your product is going out around the world. And it is potentially a force for, causing incredible amounts of human pain and suffering. And you have no idea that, all you do is you produce this very clever piece of technology and suddenly it becomes a force for persecution. So that basic level of understanding of how your product could become a force for religious separation and persecution is important, not just in technology, but it could be in any product area. You could be selling cheeseburgers around the world and fall on the wrong side of a religious frame. And I'm curious about whether some of those risks are ones that Elizabeth, you or Claire, you have kind of come across in your travels and work.
Well, I can say a little bit about social media platforms and technology and driving religiously based violence or provoking it. I think we have the example of what happened in Benghazi, which was at least initially tied to a film that was produced in the United States by an Egyptian Coptic producer, and the film was considered blasphemous towards Islam's prophet Muhammad, and that generated a whole series of geopolitical developments, but that were linked to Benghazi. And I would take that to the broader level, which is the question of free speech versus hate speech, and the way in which technology amplifies disputes and disagreements over what constitutes free speech and what constitutes hate speech, and then the violence that may ensue from that. I mean, there's discrimination and bigotry, but then there's also violence as well. And social media platforms and technology, allow for the negatives to be amplified. And those fine distinctions between free speech and what's chilling free speech versus, controlling hate speech, I think, technology is going to continue to make this a huge issue. I mean, the Charlie Hebdo trial, for example, that's underway in France today is a reminder of that. But, I think of, what's happened to Ahmadiyya, for example, in Pakistan with great frequency. So that's sort of an intra-faith, dispute. Technology has enabled messaging, the use of social media, on accusations of blasphemous speech. And, and we see it worldwide, and it cuts across faith traditions and it cuts within faith traditions. So, those who make decisions with regard to the use of technology platforms, the speech questions, and the way they bump up against religion and religious diversity, I think are going to intensify over time.
So we have another question in the
Great.
chat.
Well, speaking of time, I know that we're about to bang into. Go ahead, Aggie. There is another question, and that'll be the last one before we have to sign off.
Yes, and thank you for the reminder about time. Yes, we received a question. It says, in speaking of the negatives or positives, how do you approach or understand the role and impact of economic boycott as a means of influencing direction or pressure for political or ideological purposes? Is it a healthy or potentially a reductive means of influence, for example, boycotting Mulan or BDS against Israel?
I don't know. I don't have a scientific answer to that. I mean, I think boycotts are also probably in the same category as sanctions insofar as the record in terms of their actual impact is very, very mixed. And I would say that in terms of boycotts in particular, they have far greater symbolic value than a real impact on the ground. But that's a completely non-scientific answer to your question. But you know, if boycotts are, it's very easy to do it today, are mediatized, then they bring attention to an issue. Again, whether they produce the outcome that the boycotters are looking for is a whole other question. But do they raise the profile and therefore have some sort of you know, symbolic value and, you know, value in terms of optics? I think with technology that's indisputable. But I'm not an expert on that, so the answer to your question is a hearty I do not know.
I think that person, whoever asked that question, needs to come to Fletcher and do their capstone on that, because that actually sounds fabulously interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, fantastic. I know this is a conversation which we know could have gone on for a long time. So I want to kind of bring this to a close with a lightning round. Okay, so really 30 seconds each for Claire and Elizabeth. Claire, we know you've got one of the greatest projects ahead of you, which is your second baby. But what's the other project as it relates to Catholic Relief Services that you're looking forward to next?
So we're in a very interesting point in our project.
And Elizabeth, the question for you is, go ahead.
The project I'm currently working on is building a nutrition research institute between Purdue University and the Ministry of Health in Laos. And this is a very interesting place to be diplomatically between the United States and the Lao government. And there's a lot of excitement about what can be built across these academic institutions, and CRS is in a very unique position to kind of broker that relationship. So that's the big challenge that I'll be working on this year.
Bhaskar, you froze when you...
Fantastic. And Elizabeth, what is the... Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. Elizabeth, tell us a little bit about a research project or a teaching project that you've got ahead that excites you.
Okay, one is an ongoing project from this summer. We did a 5-part series, which is actually on the Fletcher YouTube page, on cultural heritage in crisis. And so I'm working on a project now on cultural heritage policy and institutional religious freedom, and looking at the way in which states, and it's part of a huge project, I'm working on Turkey, the way in which cultural heritage policy affects institutional religious freedom. And it's a generalizable and comparative study. And the other thing is an emerging project that, again, has grown out of previous work at Fletcher on religious diplomacy and typologies of power. Hard, soft, smart, and sharp power, in particular soft and sharp power, in the way in which state and non-state actors are using soft and sharp power, using religion as part of their soft and sharp power toolbox and repertoire. And we're going to be looking at cases like the US, Iran, Russia, China, France, and others.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I will give the floor back to Agnes for any closing comments and details.
Thank you, and thank you both of you, Claire and Professor Prodromou, for being here today. And thank you for all of you who joined the conversation. I think it was a fascinating hour. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all the questions in the chat. At the end, we received some others that we didn't have time to address. But if you'd like to continue this conversation, please feel free to join and reach out to us here at the Fletcher School. I'm sure there's always, the doors are always open. And as we mentioned, it's a conversation series, so keep an eye out for further announcements about upcoming conversations and events just like this. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you. I hope we see you at Fletcher.
Very much. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.